Hello. In this video, I want to briefly, it's probably not going to be briefly, go through the introduction to Kant's critique of pure reason. I just can't handle it. It's awfully thick, and it's taken me some time, certainly, to get to feel like I understood a little bit of what Kant's argument is. Kant lived in the late 1700s, died just into the 1800s. He is, of course, in the Enlightenment. Kant represents a very important moment in philosophy. Some would say that there's no going back before Kant. Some have said that, of course. Others vehemently disagree. But the context of Kant is he was a homebody of sorts. He pretty much lived near his town of Königsberg most of his life, could have gone to teach elsewhere in the German world, but waited until he could get a post there in his hometown. So he was a bit of a homebody. The kind of the background to Kant is a long-going debate between two basic approaches in philosophy. So you had, in this corner, weighing in at who knows how much, you had the rationalists. And the rationalists were those who believed that truth was a matter of reason. So I've done a video on Descartes, and Descartes believed that basically our senses would deceive us every time, that we needed to use our reason in order to arrive at truth. And if you wanted to know what was truth, it was especially those things that you could conceive of distinctly and clearly. You also had Spinoza, would be another rationalist in that period. Leibniz. Leibniz is important background to Kant because Leibniz basically divided up everything we could know into necessary knowledge, which was reason-oriented, and then, of course, knowledge that had to do with our senses that was contingent knowledge, not necessary truths, but truths that, like, for example, let's say I say the sun came up at 6:43. Well, that's not a necessary truth. The sun could come up at 5:43, and it probably will one day. Rationalists were those who basically said that reason was the path to truth. Rowing in this corner are the empiricists, who basically said that truth was a matter of the senses. John Locke would be kind of the father of modern empiricism. There was George Berkeley, an Irish gentleman, and then, of course, David Hume. And David Hume was the one who Kant says in his Prolegomena to any future metaphysic, he says that Hume woke me from my dogmatic slumber. Because basically what Hume said is, Hume kind of agreed with Leibniz in this idea of there being two truths that were necessary, like math, and truths that came from your senses. But Hume believed that only the truths that came from your senses really mattered. As I think Locke said, and maybe before Locke even, there's nothing in my head that wasn't first in my senses. But Hume pointed out that if that's true, then there's a whole lot of things that you can't say are meaningful or true. So, for example, causation. I can experience this moment and I can experience this moment, but the cause effect that glues those two moments together, I don't experience the law of cause and effect. I experience moment one, moment two, moment three, moment four. So all of these kinds of connections that we make between a cause and an effect, or between a fact and its value. So, for example, if you slap me in the face, that hurts. That's a fact. But to say you shouldn't slap me in the face, a value, how do you get there? What's the glue that holds the fact to the value? And so Hume, by pushing empiricism to its logical end, basically demonstrated that there are a whole lot of things that you cannot really say on the basis of experience alone. And so this is what leads to Kant. Kant is trying to figure out how there can be truths that are in some way a bridge between necessary truths of reason and the truths that have to do with our senses. Well, Kant had two different introductions, one for his first edition and another for his second edition. So for the first edition in 1781, maybe I shouldn't have done bullet points on his introduction, but basically he's trying to figure out metaphysics. What is metaphysics, you ask? Well, metaphysics is basically that part of philosophy that asks what is real. And in Kant's case, how do I glue all these things together? What are the first principles? What are the foundational principles of knowledge and truth? These are not a matter of experience, and so they're a matter of reason. But they're not necessary truths, as Hume pointed out. So how can we have a firm ground for metaphysics, for reality, that glues things together like cause and effect, or questions of God, questions of free will, questions of immortality? I've never experienced immortality. How do I know that immortality is a necessary truth? How do I know that morality is a necessary truth? There are problems to the way Kant puts some of this together, I think, but this is just the introduction, right? He says in his first edition introduction that metaphysics is an area, or preface rather, not the introduction, because I'm about to talk about the introduction. Metaphysics is an area of first principles in which we need for reason to be able to process our experience. But he thinks that he's solved the problem that nobody else has solved before him, the problem of metaphysics. Metaphysics used to be a matter of assumption, of dogmatism. And then because of Hume, it seemed like metaphysics was nonsense, because Hume basically showed that the kinds of first principles that we assume so often, like causation, space, time, that these things can't be demonstrated at all, because they don't come from our senses. So he thinks that now is the time to have a critical investigation of pure reason, and he thinks he's found the solution to all metaphysical problems. I mean, the preface, let me change introduction to preface, it's bugging me. There, bink, it's preface. The preface to the first edition actually sounds kind of cocky. I've found the solution to all metaphysical problems. Of course, I do think that he's come up with something quite brilliant, as we'll see in a second. Preface to the second edition. So this is in 1787, 6 years later. It's quite different, completely rewritten. He talks about how, well, logic is good to go. Logic has pretty much been cooked since Aristotle. Nobody's really transformed logic for a very long time. Now he begins to kind of introduce what he's going to do in this book. Reason involves some things that are known a priori and some things that are known a posteriori. A priori means from before. So there are things that we don't get from experience. There are things that we realize that they just must be true. And we know this without experiencing the world. Things that are known a posteriori are things that we know after we've experienced. So the knowledge that is a posteriori is knowledge that comes through our senses. Knowledge that is a priori comes from our reason. Now, he would say that math and physics both involve a priori things. Now, of course, physics has gotten a lot more complicated than it was. There are some truths that have been established by experiment rather than by reason, but let's leave that out. He lived in the late 1700s. He would say that metaphysics is a priori knowledge, and therein is the problem. How can we have a priori knowledge of cause and effect, and space and time, and morality, and those sorts of things? So he would say that previously the idea is that our knowledge must conform to the objects. So our mind conforms to what we observe, to what we experience. But he is going to argue that actually objects are conformed to our a priori knowledge, that the way we see the world is dependent upon our mind, what I call our mind software. He didn't know that. I would liken Kant's philosophy to, you type things into a computer, right? I've created a PowerPoint here for this video. The software of PowerPoint has rules for how information is added. The content of this PowerPoint comes from the input, from the senses, as it were. But the way that the content is organized happens according to the rules that are innate in the laptop, that are a priori in the computer. And so this is kind of, Kant believes that the content of our knowledge comes from our senses, but that the organizing principles of our knowledge comes through our reason, and especially through certain a priori categories that are built into our mind software. So the things that we experience have two aspects. There is the way they appear to us, and then there is the thing itself, das Ding an sich, the thing itself. I can't know, I'm looking at a tree right now out my window. I can't know that tree as it is an sich in itself. Das Ding an sich of the tree, I can't know. I can only know that tree as it appears to me, that is, as my mind, as the a priori concepts of my mind have categorized and organized and perceived the tree. The tree conforms to my software, as it were. Well, okay, preface to the second edition. So let's go ahead and get into the introduction. Now, this is the introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason, which is the work of Kant that we're looking at here. So the first section is, he talks about the difference between pure knowledge and empirical knowledge. Empirical knowledge is the knowledge that comes from experience, the knowledge that comes through my senses. So he admits all knowledge begins with experience, with respect to time, that is. It starts with something being inputted. I can have, it's kind of like, I may have PowerPoint open, but until I input something into PowerPoint, no knowledge is in PowerPoint. Does that make any sense? So all inputting of knowledge begins with my experience. It's the first thing that happens. However, that doesn't mean that all of our knowledge comes from experience. Some knowledge is a priori, that is, it's built into my software. The existence of God, he would put into this category. The existence of morality, he would kind of put in this category. Some knowledge is a priori, known apart from experience. My knowledge from experience comes after the fact, a posteriori. A priori knowledge, he says, can be either pure or impure, which is interesting here. The impure a priori knowledge, I think, is what he's going to call synthetic a priori knowledge in a second. That's the way I'm interpreting this. If you're a Kantian scholar, please correct me if I'm wrong. All right, so section number 2. Human intellect, he would say, has some a priori knowledge. That is some knowledge. There's some knowledge in our head before we experience the world. I know this sounds like it contradicts, but I think he's talking about the operating system of my mind. A priori truths that come before I experience anything, have two characteristics. They are necessary truths and they are universal truths. They are truths that it could not possibly be otherwise, okay? So all change involves cause and effect. He would say that's a universal truth and it's a necessary truth, but it's not necessarily a truth that is experienced. So empirical truths, experiential truths, are contingent, which Aristotle called accident. They're accidents, not accidents in the, oops, I've fallen and I can't get up, but accidents as in they are not part of the essence of something. Something could be so I could be Ken with or without hair. My hair is an accidental property of Ken. If you shave my head, I'm still Ken, I think. You know, so contingent characteristics of something are not necessary. They are accidental in a philosophical sense, okay? Third section, philosophy needs to we need to get to the bottom of these a priori truths. which is, of course, why Kant is writing this book. He would say some of our cognitions rise above my experience. My knowledge of cause-effect would be an example of that. I have cause-effect software. I have space and time software. These things are part of my mind, not part of the world itself, as far as we know. They are the way my mind is built by God, he would say, to process the world. So there are some of the problems of pure reason that we need to figure out, and he'll work on in this book. Include things like God, free will, and immortality. Okay, now we begin to cook. Now we're starting to cook. Section 4, analytic and synthetic propositions. So analytic judgments are those in which the predicate is entailed in the subject. So if I say all single people are unmarried, well, that's an analytic comment because by the definition of single, you're unmarried. And so all bodies have extension. Well, that's just part of what a body is. A body takes up space. Extension means takes up space. So that's an analytical judgment. The last part of the sentence is entailed in the first part of the sentence. So he would say that synthetic judgments is everything else. Every other judgment in which the predicate is not entailed in the subject. So that fox is a meter long. Well, this is synthetic because not all foxes are a meter long. A fox is not a meter long by definition. This is an empirical observation, by the way. So before Kant, this is the thing, before Kant, now I think the terms analytic and synthetic are mostly Kantian terms, okay? By the way, Kant critiques, this is a tangent, Kant critiques the ontological argument of Anselm by saying that Anselm mixes an analytical premise with a synthetic premise, and thus I'm going to stop there. But if you know the ontological argument for the existence of God, it basically is that God is the greatest possible being that could exist. That's an analytic statement according to Kant, because by definition God is the greatest possible being. That's what God is. But then the second premise of the ontological argument is God would not be the greatest if he didn't actually exist. Well, that's not an analytical statement. That's a synthetic. And so therefore, the ontological argument concludes, therefore God exists. But Kant says these are two propositions that they don't go together. One's analytic, one's synthetic, and therefore Anselm's ontological argument doesn't work. Or Descartes, I think Kant would say. Anyway, so Hume would say you have truths of I forget how Hume calls it, but you have these truths that are analytical, as Kant puts it, and then you have these truths that are empirical. And so and Leibniz, who's a rationalist, would say similar things. What Kant says is we need to create a third category or a subcategory of synthetic judgments that are a priori. So they are not truths by definition, but they are not truths that come from experience. So if we say everything that happens has a cause, this would be an example of what Kant is calling a synthetic a priori judgment. Now, it's not something that is true by definition. So at least Kant would say it isn't. Leibniz would say it is, I think. But what Kant would say is that this is true as a priori synthetic judgment, which is something that neither Hume nor Leibniz even thought of. And so Kant thinks, I've solved it all. So section 5 in the introduction. A priori synthetic judgments in the theoretical sciences. Here he's primarily thinking of like math and physics. So he would say mathematical judgments are always synthetical, by which he means that the things we say about math are one. Well, he's going to argue that they're not analytical. That is, they are not they're not true by definition, he would say, but they are not necessarily they're not truths that we learn by experience either. They fall in this new category he's created of synthetic a priori judgments. So they're not based on experience, but they are always synthetical. Now he uses the example of 5 plus 7 equals 12. He says 12 is not entailed in 5 and 7. It's not an analytic truth, but it's a priori. That is, we don't have to experience 5 apples and 7 apples being 12 apples. We don't have to experience that in order to know that 5 plus 7 is 12. It's a priori truth. But he would say that the 12 is not contained in 5 and 7. It's a different attribution. I'm not sure I've not gotten my head around this example to know whether I agree with him. And I also wonder if, for example, Bertrand Russell in the early 1900s did a lot of work. Most of it was a waste of time, probably, but Bertrand Russell spent a lot of time trying to put math on a pure logical foundation. And so I think he at least got as far as to say that 5 plus 7 equals 12 is entailed. I may be completely wrong here. Please, again, if you're a Kantian scholar, weigh in on this. But that 12 is entailed in 5 and 7. Anyway, I'm not fully sure I agree with Kant here. But Kant would argue that all math is both synthetical and a priori. I'm kind of okay with the a priori bit. I'm just not sure whether it's synthetical. He would say, here's another example of a synthetic a priori truth. A straight line between 2 points is the shortest. Well, he would say that the concept of straight does not contain in it a length matter. And therefore, he would say this is a synthetic proposition. However, it's a priori. Everybody knows it without having ever experienced a straight line. Now, again, it is definitely synthetic, I think. I think he's right that it's synthetic, and I think he's also right that it's a priori. So I might agree with him on this one. Although I will say that in geometry, it was not presented in this way. The way that this was presented in geometry was that the shortest distance between a line and a point not on the line is the perpendicular segment, and that can be proved in geometry. However, I think I buy this one. I buy this one better than this one, but it might be that I don't understand. He would say that physics is similar. Of course, he never knew quantum physics, but he would say that physics is similar. You know, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. He said that is true on the basis of reason. There, I'm not sure. You know, I'm not sure whether that isn't an empirical observation and not a rational one. But he would say that physics, by and large, is also in the realm of synthetic a priori truth. And he would say the problem with metaphysics is, heretofore, is that metaphysics also fits into this category of synthetic a priori propositions. But because Hume didn't have that category, metaphysics just, you know, and so he believes that his work in critiquing pure reason is creating a space for metaphysics to exist again. In fact, he will write another work that I've already mentioned called A Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysic. Okay, so he's preparing the way of the metaphysic. So section 4, actually section 6, the problem of pure reason. So what is this book about? This book is asking the question, how is it that what he's calling synthetic a priori judgments are possible? How is that possible? And so he would say that that is where metaphysics rides. Metaphysics does not have to do with the objects of reasons like that tree, but it has to do with the way reason itself works, the categories of reason. So he is writing, section 7 of the introduction, a critique of pure reason. That's what this book is called. That's what this book is about. Reason is the faculty that furnishes us with the basic principles of a priori knowledge. he calls this transcendental knowledge, knowledge of the modes of our cognition, not knowledge of the objects, but knowledge of how our brain, the transcendental properties of metaphysics that tell us how our brain works, how our mind, let me use the word mind rather than brain, how our mind works to understand, or not to understand, but to process things that appear. And a transcendental philosophy would be a systematic presentation of all these conceptions, a system of all the principles of pure reason. Now, this book is not that. This book is a preparation for that. Before we can systematize all these conceptions, we've got to figure out what these categories are by critiquing pure reason. A critique of pure reason will prepare for a transcendental philosophy by outlining what the structure of that transcendental philosophy would look like. Well, okay, we made it. This has been a video on the introduction and the two prefaces to Kant's classic work, Critique of Pure Reason.